Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to what is our final Adam Smith Week event. I'm happy to have you all here for this afternoon. So, for those of you who may not know me, I am Peter Calcano, a professor of economics at the College of Charleston and the director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. The mission of the center is to advance the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. We do this through a variety of programming, most of which is student-focused, including reading groups, speaker series, and of course, Adam Smith Week. We do regional reading groups, so we try to interact with students outside of the College of Charleston in partners with the region, so students can get opportunities to talk about these ideas with their peers. And we are, of course, thrilled that you all are here today and hope that you have been enjoying this week. I want to take just a second because I want to acknowledge all of our sponsors for this week. We have had several. John William Pope Foundation, Liberty Fund, Independent Institute, American Institute for Economic Research, Free to Choose Network. And so I want to thank all of them for helping us to get this week off the ground and to make it such a success. And I want to also point out two things here. One is that we have a QR code here on these table tents. So if you click those, you'll get a survey that will tell us about how you thought we did in terms of this speaker, and that helps us. We'll collect information about you so that if you do need to have any of that information shared with a professor to recognize that you were here, we will do that as well. In addition, you will see other QR codes that say scan me, and we would appreciate it if you would do those and register. That is a different piece of information that we're collecting for one of our donors. Finally, I want to say to you, right, that we have over here on the tables that you can take on your way out if you want copies of Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. There are two copies. There's a volume 1 and a volume 2. So anybody who would like a copy, right, on your way out, please feel free to take one. These were generously provided by Liberty Fund. One of the star programs in the Center for Public Choice and Market Process is our mentoring program. We have two programs, Market Process Scholars and Public Choice Associates. And these are students that get an opportunity to really thoroughly engage with the center. And so at this point in time, I want to bring up one of our Market Process Scholars, Denise Hurd, to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last speaker for the Adam Smith Week. Today, I get the privilege of introducing Dr. Bryan Cutsinger. Dr. Cutsinger is an assistant professor at Florida Atlantic University, as well as a Phil Smith Fellow at the Phil Smith Center for Free Enterprise. He is also an associate editor for the journal Public Choice and a Sound Money Project Fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. His research focuses primarily on monetary theory, economic history, and political economy, with work published in leading academic journals such as the Economics Letters and Public Choice, and news outlets like the Wall Street Journal and the National Review. Today, he will be speaking on how and why the Fed got inflation wrong and what we can do about it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cutsinger.
Thank you, Denise, for the very kind invitation. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Pete and the whole team here for having me out. Before I get started, if I can share just a kind of a story for why this is important to me. 10 years ago, I was in my first year of my PhD program at George Mason University, and I think I saw on Facebook something about Adam Smith Week at the College of Charleston. Now, if you know much about the type of student who would go get a PhD in economics from George Mason University, you know we're kind of weird. We love this sort of stuff, sitting around and reading old books, and I had to pinch myself at the time thinking that, you know, even as a GMU PhD student, that that there are people that are getting together to talk about Adam Smith for a week. This is the coolest thing on earth, right? If you told me 10 years ago that I would get invited 10 years later to come present, I would have never guessed, certainly on the 250th anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations. So thank you sincerely from the bottom of my heart. It means a lot to be here. So with the pleasantness out of the way, let's get a little unpleasant. All right, so how and why the Fed got inflation wrong and what to do about it. Let's start off with some polling data of our fellow citizens. If we go on and we ask our fellow citizens, what do you think causes inflation? Okay, the data does not look great here. Right? So the large corporations seeking maximum profit, 61% of Americans blame inflation. Spending by the federal government, that one's a little bit more nuanced. I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. The price of foreign oil, the COVID-19 pandemic. This one is my favorite. 42% of Americans blame Democrats a lot for inflation. Right? So you may have heard of the quantity theory money. This would be the Democrat theory money, I guess. Republicans, they get 32% of the blame. Consumer purchases on credit, okay. The level of consumer demand, now we might be getting to something a little bit closer to what economists typically treat as being the source of inflation. And then wage demands by large unions. This is a popular theory, more so in the United Kingdom. These are called wage price spirals. It gets worse, though, if we decide to ask by political affiliation, who do they blame inflation on? We get to spending by the federal government, 31% of Democrats, 77% of Republicans. Large corporations seeking maximum profits, 44% of Republicans, 76% of Democrats. My favorite is that 14% of Democrats blame Democrats for inflation. Very odd. Unsurprisingly, Republicans, 74% of Republicans say yes, it's definitely the Democrats' fault. Again, none of these are exactly what economists think about when we think about the underlying causes of inflation. So maybe Adam Smith has something to tell us about this. In fact, I think a theme that I've picked up on from all the events that we've had and from the lectures that I've sent in so far is that there's a reason we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the publication of Wealth of Nations. And that reason is that there's still a lot of wisdom to be learned from Smith. So what Smith is saying here on the causes of inflation, he's talking about the discovery of gold and silver in North and South America. And he observes the discovery of the abundant mines of America seems to have been the sole cause of the diminution in the value of silver. And here in bold, the increase of the supply had exceeded that of the demand, that the value of that metal sunk considerably. In other words, if you produce more money than people want to hold, the value of that money will decline. In other words, inflation is primarily a monetary phenomenon. When I was getting to put this presentation together, I actually thought it might be interesting to contrast David Hume's monetary theory from Adam Smith's monetary theory. They're actually quite different. I'm actually closer to Team Smith on this than I am to Hume, and if at the end we've got enough time, if you want to talk about the distinction between the two, we can. I say that because it's actually hard to find a quote in Smith linking the quantity of money to inflation. This is actually one of the only in the Wealth of Nations, and in part that reflects Smith's views of inflation and how they differed a little bit from his colleague David Hume. Okay, so let's start. Let's get everyone on the same page so that maybe you were identified with some of that polling data. That's okay, right? The reason we go to college is to escape our own ignorance and to learn a little bit more. So let's get on the same page. What is inflation? Inflation is an ongoing increase in the general level of prices quoted in units of money. So what we mean by ongoing here is we don't just mean a one-time increase in the average level of prices. Moreover, we're talking about the average level of prices, so we don't mean just an increase in the price of gasoline. We're currently experiencing that right now. An increase in the price of eggs a couple years ago. My students knew that I loved the egg meme, so I just got bombarded with the eggs and the inflation memes. They are quite great. But the basic idea here is that if the average level of prices is rising by 2% a year, we would say there's about 2% inflation. If the average level of prices quoted in units of money is rising about 4% a year, we'd say there's 4% inflation. Now, how do we measure this? There's a variety of ways. All of them have their problems, but we use price indices. The one that you're likely familiar with is the Consumer Price Index. That's collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and released at the beginning of every month. The other that the Federal Reserve targets is called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. That is collected by the Bureau of Economic Analysis and released at the end of the month. Both of them are basically trying to get a measure of the average price in the economy. In essence, what they're doing is they're following you around at the grocery store. They're looking at what you're putting in your grocery basket. They're writing down the prices that you pay and the quantities of those things that you purchased. And then they're going to look at how the price of that basket has changed over time. And if the price of that basket is rising by, say, 2% every year, we would say there's 2% inflation. So, all on the same page on what inflation is. Now, the question we want to answer is, well, how do we think about the causes of inflation? And there, we want to make an observation, which is that every dollar spent by somebody is a dollar received as income by somebody else. Okay? There's two sides to every transaction, and those two sides of the transaction necessarily balance. Every dollar spent by somebody is received by somebody else as income. And from this it follows that spending growth, that is the growth rate of how much we are spending, must equal our income growth. Again, because every dollar spent by somebody is a dollar received as income by somebody else. Now we can break this down a little bit. We can say, well, what is spending growth? Well, we can think about spending growth as being the sum of two components. One is the growth rate of the money supply. If there's more money in the economy, there's going to be, or the rate at which the money supply is increasing is going up, we're going to get an increase in spending growth. This is controlled primarily by the Fed. The other component of spending growth is velocity. This is, in essence, how quickly are people spending the dollars? If people think there's going to be a lot of inflation, velocity tends to rise very rapidly, even before there's actually been an increase in the money supply. This is one of the things that makes getting hyperinflation under control so difficult. On the income side, we can break down income growth as being the sum of two components as well. One of them is going to be inflation, determined by question mark. That's what we're trying to figure out. And the other is going to be real output growth, or real GDP. And if you've taken your principles of macro or intermediate macro, you know that real GDP is going to be determined by things like labor, capital, technology, and institutions. Okay? So we're going to put this together. Now, I know that for every equation you include in a presentation, you lose 10 audience members. I've got 2 up here, so I'm down 20. But there's a lot of intuition that can be gained from looking at this mathematically, I think. And so what we say is that, look, we know that spending growth must equal income growth. So it's just a tiny bit of algebra. We can solve this for inflation. And what do we get? We say that inflation depends on spending growth, which ultimately is controlled by the Federal Reserve. That's what's circled in red there. And then real output growth. So if spending growth rises and real output growth stays the same, we're going to get more inflation. If spending growth falls and real output stays the same, we're going to get less inflation. By the same logic, if we hold spending growth constant, we get more real GDP growth, we're going to get lower inflation. We hold spending growth constant, we get lower GDP growth, we're going to get more inflation. That's what this equation tells us. We call this the equation of exchange. It's true by definition. It's not even really a theory. It's mainly an accounting identity. So we can use this to assess what happened over the last 5 years, because you guys, myself included, have the dubious distinction of living through the highest inflation in 40 years. In fact, the last time inflation was as high as it was a couple years ago was right around the time that I was being born in 1981. So, what did Powell have to say about this? Jerome Powell, he's the chair of the Federal Reserve. He's asked in January 2025, what role did the Federal Reserve play in the COVID inflation? And in particular, what role did the Fed's monetary framework play in the inflation? And the reason they're asking Powell at this press conference about the framework is that starting at the beginning of 2025, the Fed was going to reassess its monetary framework. In August of 2020, it had adopted a framework that we call flexible average inflation targeting. We'll have a lot more to say about that. But basically, Powell's answer to the question of what was the Fed's role in the inflation and what was the Fed's framework's role in inflation was the following. It was an exogenous event. We looked at the inflation as transitory, right? We all remember this horrible word. Right up to the point where the data turned against that. When the data turned against that in late 21, we changed our view and we raised rates a lot, but the framework was more irrelevant than anything else. So what we're going to do is we're going to go assess these claims, right? Or as the football coach says, let's go to the tape. So, was the inflation exogenous? That, I think, is so Powell's claim is that it's exogenous. It's unclear what he means by that. In fact, he's probably being intentionally unclear, as many Fed chair men and women tend to be. I think what he likely means is that the inflation was primarily supply driven. So we think back to COVID, if you're old enough to remember. We couldn't work closely with one another. We had supply constraints because there wasn't global trade going on. We couldn't produce as much as there was before. And so I think what Powell has in mind is that if we were to hold spending growth constant, that there should be this inverse relationship between real GDP growth and inflation, right? So if we hold spending growth constant at, let's say, 4% a year, right, then we should expect there to be a one-to-one inverse relationship between real GDP growth and inflation. And that argument is as fine as far as it goes, right? It absolutely is the case that a supply shock like COVID could raise inflation, but the problem here is a question of magnitude. Does anybody know what long-run real GDP growth is in the United States? Not the econ professors. Okay, the econ professors can answer. 2%. It's about 2%. It's about 2%. Okay. So let's suppose that spending growth, right, the thing that I have at the bar over there, let's say that's rising at 4% a year, which, by the way, is what the Fed projected spending growth would be in December of 2019, before the pandemic started. And let's suppose that real output growth is rising by 2% a year. We would get 4% minus 2%. Some basic arithmetic gives us 2% inflation. All right, so far so good. Now, if I wanted to explain 8% inflation with 4% spending growth, what would have to be true of real GDP growth? It'd have to be negative. And it would have to be very negative. In fact, it'd have to be negative 4%, right? If you have, again, if you've taken principles of macro, intermediate macro, we would call this a growth disaster, right? Actually, if we want to explain even 1 percentage point of inflation, right, we'd have to take the 2% that we just mentioned. If you were to take 1% away from 2%, that only gives you 1 percentage point of inflation. Okay? Now, going from 2% growth to 1% growth might not seem like much, but the difference between 1% and 2% is 50%. Right? So it's actually a big cut. So the problem here is that, yes, it's absolutely true that a real shock, like a COVID-19 pandemic, could in fact raise inflation, but we have this problem of magnitude. We would have to have tremendous negative real GDP growth in order to account for inflation by looking at the supply side of the economy. But there are other problems with this view. One, the timing doesn't work out. So what I took here is real GDP. That's going to be your red line. I put it in a proportionate scale so the growth rates are all nice and smooth, makes it look real nice. The blue line is going to be the price level. This is going to be the price, the personal consumption expenditures price index. That's the price level that the Fed tries to target. And I included the 2% inflation target, which is that dashed line. Now, there's a problem here, which is that the worst of the supply constraints actually happens when the pandemic starts. Unsurprising, right? We tell everybody, hey, you can't go to work anymore. We're all just going to go home for a few weeks and not work. Output predictably falls. But notice, actually, people forget this. We had a little bit of deflation at the start of the pandemic, which you can sort of see that little tiny negative blip there at the bottom. But then the economy quickly recovers, people go back to work, and what we see is not prices rising as real GDP is falling. We see the opposite. We see real GDP rising with, oops, my apologies, Cameron. I get too animated. We see real GDP rising with prices at the exact same time. That's not at all what we would expect to see if the inflation was being driven by supply factors. And in fact, it's not until about right here that the Fed starts getting serious about tightening monetary policy. All right, so right off the bat, there's a big problem with the timing here because we experience the worst of the inflation after the economy is recovered. That is not what the equation of exchange tells us we should see. But there's another problem, and that is the persistence problem. So again, if you've taken principles of macroeconomics, we likely tortured you with the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And what does that aggregate demand and aggregate supply model say? It says if there's a negative real shock, like a pandemic, prices go up, and then as the economy recovers, what happens? They come back down. Let's go to the tape. Prices dipped below the Fed's 2% inflation target, but by the spring of 21, they had actually recovered to the Fed's 2% pre-pandemic path, and then they kept blowing past that, and they continue to blow past that, despite the fact, as we just saw here, that the economy recovered rather quickly. So again, we've got a timing problem, and we've got a persistence problem. If this had been a supply shock, the timing would have worked out. It didn't, and certainly you cannot explain a permanently higher price level by focusing only on a negative GDP shock. It just doesn't work. Okay, so what was the real problem? Little play on words here. The real problem was nominal. So what I did was now the Fed does not give us a projection of spending growth, but you can back it out by looking at their summary of economic projections. So once a quarter, the FOMC gets together, and all the FOMC members with their teams, they produce a projection of unemployment, they produce a projection of inflation, they produce a projection of real GDP growth, and they produce a projection of the federal funds rate, which is the Fed's policy rate. So what you can do, because you now know the equation, the equation of exchange, you can just add the Fed's inflation projection to their real GDP projection, and voila, you now have a projection of spending growth. That's this blue line right here. The red line is actual spending growth. Okay? So by the spring of 2021, now we only get GDP data quarterly, so we can cut the Fed a little slack here, but by the spring of 2021, total dollar spending in the economy had recovered to where it would have been if you were projecting where you thought it would be before the pandemic started. And then it blew past it, and it kept blowing past it. And it's now, of course, much higher than it would have been if the Fed had actually hit the projected rate of spending growth that it announced in December of 2019. So why did the Fed get it wrong? So one, I think the Fed misdiagnosed the source of inflation. They blame supply side factors rather than looking at demand. And in fact, if they had been focused more on demand, if they had even been focused a little bit more on inflation or on money supply growth, it would have been very clear what the primary driver of inflation was. But they continue to blame the supply side factors. It's actually worse than you might expect. I'll show you in the next slide. They continue to blame supply side factors despite the mounting evidence even in early or mid to late 2021, the evidence to the contrary. So the timing rules out the supply side story. That doesn't work. Inflation rose with output. We know that can't happen, all right, if it's a supply shock. And the persistence rules out the whole it's transitory supply shock stuff. So if you want to get a sense of just how big the screw up was, what you can do is you can go look at the summary of economic projections, and that's what I did. So in March of 2021, the Fed gets together for their first meeting of the year. Actually, probably their third meeting of the year, but the first meeting where they're going to give a summary of economic projections. And they project that for 2021, we're going to experience 2.4% inflation. That's what they project we're going to experience. However, by the time they're making this projection in March, we've already experienced 5.1% inflation. So what does that mean? It means that in order for the Fed's projection to be accurate, when we've already experienced 5.1% inflation, we're going to have to experience 2.2% inflation on average for the remaining months in order for this projection to be accurate. Now, what's more, notice, by the way, that the median projection of the federal funds rate is 0.1%. That's pretty darn low, right? So in other words, the Fed is saying, we know we've experienced 5.1 percentage points 5.1% inflation so far this year. We expect there's only going to be 2.4% for the whole year, which would require 2.2% for the rest of the year. Oh, and by the way, we're actually not going to tighten monetary policy at all. It gets worse. Fast forward to June, the next time the Fed gets together to release their summary of economic projections. Now the Fed says, okay, we missed it in March. It's going to be a bit higher than we thought. It's going to be 3.4% for 2021. But at that point, the Fed had access to data indicating that we had already, up to that point in time, experienced 5.7% inflation, meaning that inflation would have to be 2.3% for the remainder of the year, and any change in the federal funds rate? Those of you who've taken money in banking, any tightening in monetary policy here? No. In other words, the Fed says inflation's going to come down on its own. It's not going to require any tightening whatsoever. Now it gets really bad. So they meet again in September to issue another set of projections. And in September, they say, okay, We know we said back in March it's going to be 2.4% inflation for the year. It's actually looking like it's going to be 4.2, but we've already experienced 5.9. In order for that projection to be accurate, we would have to experience 1.9% below target. Below target inflation. And by the way, raising the policy rate? No, right? Not raising the policy rate. Okay, so again, this is textbook of diagnosing the problem as a supply shock, but totally missing the ball. Now December rolls around. They say, okay, we're actually going to have 5.3% inflation. Now keep in mind, they're making this projection in December. They've got data through November. They're only waiting on one more month, right? Averages are kind of funny this way, right? So by December, they say we're going to experience 5.3% for all of 2021. We have experienced 5.8% inflation up to this point so far this year, which means that all of a sudden, randomly, inflation is just going to fall to 2.7% annualized in December. Oh, and by the way, are we going to raise the policy rate? No, we are not going to raise the policy rate. Now keep in mind Powell's quote. He says, look, as soon as the data turned against this, we acted aggressively. Keep in mind, the Fed retired the term transitory in November of 2021, before that December projection. Okay? So the Fed has abandoned the idea of transitory, at least as an official statement. They've abandoned the position that the inflation was transitory, but a month later, they're still treating it as what? Transitory, by not actually raising the policy rate. Now they start to get a bit more serious. March 2022, they say we're going to have 4.3% inflation in 2022, but by the time they're making that projection, we've already experienced 6% inflation, which would require 4.1% for the rest of the year, but now they finally start raising the policy rate. Okay, now again, remember, Powell says as soon as the data turned against the view, we acted aggressively and appropriately to raise rates. Okay, they didn't actually start raising rates until March of 2022, and even then it was only a 25 basis point increase. Pretty small, especially considering the fact that, again, we were living through 40-year high inflation. Now, June 2022, they say we're going to get 5.2% inflation for the year, but we've already experienced 5.8. That would require 4.3 for the year, and now the Fed starts taking some pretty aggressive action. But keep in mind, this is 6 months after the December projections and 7 months after the Fed said we retired the term transitory. Now, sometimes a picture is better than a table. So what I did is I took the PCEPI, the price index that the Fed focuses on, and I said, at every point of these projections, what would the price level have looked like if the Fed had been right? Okay, and so that's what I put together here. And you can see just how insane this view was, right? Inflation's rising, and then all of a sudden it's just going to stop, and then it's just going to like flatline out, right? Okay, we're experiencing a little bit more, but it's just going to stop for reasons we don't understand, right? And it's not until you get all the way until mid to late April that the Fed even 2022, mid to late 2022, that the Fed even comes close to getting the price level on target with its actual behavior. So they kept getting it wrong, they kept getting it wrong, and they kept getting it wrong. So another way of looking at this, Powell says they acted aggressively as soon as the data turned against the view. One way to assess that statement is to say, was the federal funds rate positive, right, in real terms? So what I did is I calculated the real federal funds rate, and we plotted it here against the nominal federal funds rate to see if that Powell was in fact right, that they started acting aggressively as soon as the data turned against this view. And what you will notice is that as late as April 2022, right, the federal funds rate was still negative. It wasn't until the summer of 2022 that the federal funds rate even became positive, which you might regard as like restrictive monetary policy. Okay? Again, that's 6 months after the December projection where the Fed says it's not transitory. Okay? So it's very difficult to square the evidence with Powell's claim. Now, this was made worse by the Fed's flexible average inflation targeting framework. So why was the Fed so willing to tolerate above target inflation for so long? And the reason is that in August of 2020, the Federal Reserve adopted a new framework called flexible average inflation targeting, as opposed to just simple inflation targeting. Flexible average inflation targeting means something like we're looking at 2% inflation on average, but we're okay if inflation goes above or below 2% for prolonged periods of time, as long as over an average some time period, of course they never specified what that was, because if it's a 100-year flexible average inflation target, there's a lot of wiggle room. They never actually said what that was, but the basic idea is that the Fed would be comfortable with above target inflation. And what's worse, as I'll show you here shortly, the framework had no commitment to return the price level to trend. In other words, if the Fed was going to overshoot its inflation target, there was no guarantee that it would undershoot to get the price level path back to the 2% trajectory. Okay? So why did they do this? And if you want, we can get into the weeds on this in the Q&A if there's time. The basic idea is that coming out of the financial crisis, so by the way here, I've got inflation from January 2010 to the end of 2019. For a good part of the decade out of the Great Recession and global financial crisis, the Fed was not able to hit its inflation target. And so the Fed was concerned that they were losing credibility, and they needed to commit to actually hitting their 2% inflation target, which meant that they would let inflation run above 2% to get the inflation rate up to 2% on average. That was the underlying logic. I don't buy this, but I'm trying to give you the sort of steel man case for why they did this. Now, the problem is that when they announced this, they didn't lie, or in fact they were quite clear what they were doing, but it was not obvious when they first announced what they meant by flexible average inflation targeting. Most people thought that this is what they meant. What they meant was that, hey, if we undershoot, we will overshoot to get the price level back up to trend, so that when you guys are thinking about buying cars or making loans or whatever, you have a reasonable, good sense of what the purchasing power of your money will be at some point in the future. But people also thought that if the Fed overshot its inflation target, that they would either allow zero inflation or potentially even some deflation to get the price level back down to trend. Again, to make the price level path predictable for those of us who are making loans and buying things over time and whatever. But there's actually a very funny moment in a press conference with Powell where reporters start asking him about flexible average inflation targeting, and they did the meme, the Padme meme, courtesy of ChatGPT, by the way. My colleague Tom Hogan made sort of a rough-looking version of this yesterday. I gave Tom, because it was from a number of years ago, I gave ChatGPT my friend Thomas's meme and had it remake it, and now it's glorious. So we've got Jay Powell here saying, following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. Padme, of course, wanting to clarify what we actually mean here, she says, so periods with above target inflation will be followed by periods of below target inflation. And Powell's face, like Anakin's, says it all, and Padme says, above 2% followed by below 2%, right? Wrong. So the reporters ask Powell, they say, wait, doesn't it mean that if you have a flexible average inflation target that you have to make up for undershoots and overshoots? And Powell said, no, that's not at all what average means. Led to more confusion. So what did the Fed actually do? They adopted an asymmetric flexible average inflation target. So how does an asymmetric flexible average inflation target work? Well, it says, look, if you undershoot, we're going to let inflation run above 2% to get back up to path. That's as fine as far as it goes. Okay? But if we overshoot, we're never going to bring the price level path back down to where it would have been if we had actually hit our inflation target on average over time. And if you look at the actual data, now I took this all the way up through midway through last year, that theoretical diagram looks an awful lot like the actual data. As you might imagine, or you've probably likely experienced, the things at the grocery store that you buy are more expensive. Your gas is more expensive. Your cars are more expensive. Everything's more expensive. Why? Because the Fed adopted an asymmetric flexible average inflation target with no means of bringing the price level back down to the to the level that you would have expected. So, I say false. Might disagree with me. I'm sure Powell would disagree with me. I even have some friends that would disagree with me about this. But I think when you look at the thing here, it was an exogenous event. I agree that COVID-19 was certainly outside of the Fed's control, but we looked at the inflation as transitory right up to the point when the data turned against that. The data turned against that at least midway through 2021, and they didn't get serious about raising the policy rate until midway through 2022. They waited an entire year. We changed our view and raised rates a lot. Again, not true. In March, they only raised rates by 25 basis points. It's not until the summer of 2022 that they start raising rates by 75 basis points. And then finally, but the framework was more irrelevant than anything else. And again, I think that's wrong because the framework basically said, you can make up for undershoots, but we're not going to make up for overshoots. So what can we do about this? Earlier this year, we had a monetary policy conference at Florida Atlantic University, and my colleague Will Luther asked me to talk about central bank independence and monetary rules. And I found this great picture. Do they still make you read the Odyssey? Yes, okay, good. Good, there's lots of lessons in the Odyssey. Ulysses is on his way home from the Trojan War. He is aware that there are some sirens. These sirens, I don't know if they're particularly beautiful or whatever it happens to be, but the problem with the sirens is that they sing a song. And if you hear this song, you're going to want to steer your ship into the rocks. You and all your men will die, and the sirens, I guess, feast upon your bones and entrails or whatever. I've missed that part of the story. So what does Ulysses do? Right? Ulysses wants to hear the siren song, but Ulysses also knows that if he hears the siren song, he will make a decision that's not only bad for himself, he will make a decision that's bad for his men. So what does he order his men to do? Tie him to the mast and do one other thing. To put beeswax in their ears. Because he knows that if he's given the opportunity to make a choice under a particular rule set, he will make the wrong choice. Okay? So he voluntarily binds his own hands. And this is much the reason for monetary rules. That oftentimes both politicians and central bankers, if they're given the choice, they might actually make the wrong choice. And so the rationale behind imposing some kind of monetary rule on the central bank is that politicians and central bankers often find themselves in the position of Ulysses. So what sort of rules might have prevented this, or could the Fed have adopted? And I should say, unhappily enough, that the Fed completed its framework review in August of 2025, and it's not clear that they really improved things all that much. My colleague Will Luther and Peter Ireland at Boston College, we have a new working paper out about this. If you want to read it, just send me a message. I'm happy to share it. So the easiest thing they could have done, since they had already confused us all with flexible average inflation targeting, is just make it symmetrical. Right? Because we already understood one half of how it works, so just do the other half and make it a lot more intuitive. Unfortunately, they decided not to go that route. My preferred and probably unlikely outcome ever would be for the Fed to actually target the growth rate of nominal spending. So what does that mean? Basically means let dollar incomes rise by about 4% a year. And the advantage of doing this is that when the economy grows faster than trend, like it is probably to do with AI, prices actually fall. And in fact, this is pretty intuitive. If we get more productive, you should think that the stuff we want to buy, if we're better at making it, should get cheaper. Under an inflation targeting regime, that doesn't actually happen. If we get more productive and there's downward pressure on prices, the Federal Reserve steps in to boost the inflation rate back up. Right? A nominal spending target, like what I'm proposing here, would say, hey, if real GDP goes up, if it starts growing above trend, just keep spending growth at 4%, and that's actually going to cause inflation to fall when the economy is doing very well. And by contrast, when the economy is not doing very well, inflation will go up. It turns out, if you go look at data from the New York Federal Reserve Bank Survey of Consumer Expectations, this is exactly the mental model that people have of the world. People associate poor real economic performance with high inflation, and they associate good economic performance with low inflation. In other words, people's mental model is a nominal spending target, but that's not actually what the Federal Reserve does. Okay? Now, the nice thing about this rule is if the Fed had been following it, it would have been very clear by the spring of 2021 that things were getting rapidly off track. Now, again, we only get real nominal GDP data once per quarter, so I don't expect them to adjust right away, but certainly 1 or 2 quarters later, certainly before the end of 2021, it would have been very clear that spending growth was far off the Fed's initial projection from December 2019. But the problem, I think, and I want to tie this back to Romina Baccia's presentation from a couple days ago, is this. It's by the courtesy of David Beckworth. I stole it from him from Twitter. Matt Ridley's not here, but no intellectual property, right? So here we go. Now, in fairness, David probably used ChatGPT to make it, so perhaps ChatGPT actually owns it. I don't know how that works. But the basic problem here is that unless you've been living under a rock, or if you didn't come to Romina's talk 2 nights ago, that the federal government is spending more and more and more and more and more, and that's going to make the Federal Reserve's job harder. We call this idea fiscal dominance. And so what we have here depicted in our funny meme here is that the president, and he's a stand-in, all presidents want to do this, the president, they want to spend more, but that's actually making the Federal Reserve's job harder. So it doesn't matter what the best monetary rule is. If we can't get our fiscal house in order, it's unlikely that any monetary rule will be particularly credible. So why is that? Well, at a fundamental level, if you can't cover government spending through taxes, then your deficit has to be covered by one of 2 things. You either have to issue more bonds, that is, you have to issue more debt, or you have to print money. Or I guess you could default. We're going to rule that one out because I don't think anybody wants to do that. Okay? So if debt issuance eventually becomes constrained, so for example, if the Treasury holds an auction and finds that it can't sell the Treasury debt that it wants to sell at a price that it wants to pay, because it's that price that determines the interest rate that it pays on its debt, there's no other choice but to turn to changes in the money supply. Okay? In other words, if the government can't rely on bond finance, it's going to have to rely on monetary finance. We call this seigniorage. Money growth will rise, and we go back to our wonderful little equation, inflation equation, and what do we get? Higher money growth means higher inflation. We call this the unpleasant monetarist arithmetic. And we call it unpleasant because if the Federal Reserve were to stand up to Congress and the President and say, we are not going to help you pay your bills right now, interest rates will rise. And they're going to rise for 2 reasons. One, if the Fed is going to try to neutralize the spending from the government, that means that they're not going to buy the Treasury debt. They don't buy the Treasury debt, that means lower demand for Treasury debt, which means lower prices, higher interest rates. The other is that now the Treasury is going to have to rely primarily on borrowing from the private sector. The private sector is likely going to want to be compensated with higher interest rates. So interest rates rise. What ends up happening then? Well, because we have higher interest rate on our debt service cost rises. That's because we have to pay more for our credit card, basically. What ends up happening to the deficit? As the debt servicing cost rises, our deficit rises as well. And if we get to a point where the Treasury can no longer rely on bond issuance to cover its spending, eventually we're going to have to monetize this debt by increasing the growth rate of the money supply. In other words, the reason that the monetarist arithmetic is unpleasant is that if the Fed tries to tighten monetary policy today to bring down inflation today, it's going to create even more inflation in the future because it's going to cause interest rates to rise and our debt service to rise along with it. So I went to the most recent report from the Congressional Budget Office. This was in February, so last month, I guess. And things don't look great, particularly from the unpleasant monetarist arithmetic perspective. So we look at, they projected out past 2026. You will see that total deficit is rising. That's that G minus T on the 2 slides prior. And what's happening to those net interest outlays? Right? The debt servicing costs are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the challenge right now is that if the Fed were to stand up and say, we are not going to let inflation go above 2%, we're not going to help the government pay its bills today, that means there could be even higher inflation in the future. So the very unpleasant situation we find ourselves in is have some moderate inflation now to essentially monetize part of our debts, or stand firm on the inflation target today and get even higher inflation in the future. And to bring this back full circle here, there's lots of great quotes from Smith on this phenomena. Smith understood this. He says, when national debts have accumulated to a certain degree, there is scarce, I believe, a single instance of their having been fairly and completely paid. The raising of the denomination of the coin has been the most expedient by which a real public bankruptcy has been disguised under the appearance of a pretended payment. Right? There's a reason why we should still read Smith. Okay? The same sort of government profit, I was going to get that word wrong, so I'm not going to try to pronounce it and embarrass myself. Irresponsible government spending, right? This is not new. This has been going on for a very long time, and governments historically have always resorted to the printing press, and today that's not new. So Smith continues to be relevant for understanding the world in which we live, plus he's just a pleasure to read. So wrapping up, my view, inflation was demand-driven, not supply-driven. The timing and persistence don't line up with the supply story. the Fed was far too slow to respond, and the Fed's framework made this even worse. If the Fed had adopted a credible rule, it might have been able to prevent the inflation from rising. For example, if it had done a symmetric inflation, flexible average inflation target, or a nominal income growth target. But at the end of the day, and this, if you want to talk about this in the Q&A, we can. One of the reasons why I think Fed independence is under attack, A, the Fed has not done itself any favors, but B, central bank independence is probably a fragile equilibrium. It's probably a fragile equilibrium because you can only have an independent central bank when your fiscal house is in order. And if your fiscal house isn't in order, it's not clear that you can actually sustain an independent central bank. So with that, again, thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is an honor to do it. If you want to read a paper that I wrote about this, it's up there for free. You can scan that QR code and all the good stuff about the Fed's framework. So again, thank you so much, and happy to take any questions that you have.
So we have a few minutes for questions, so I'll open it up if anyone has any questions.
Move.
Do you think we should still have a Federal Reserve?
Look, I'm sort of a squish on this. I can imagine a scenario where we go back to some type of gold standard or decentralized system, but I think it's extremely unlikely. And so I don't know how you get that genie back in the bottle. And so what I spend most of my effort on when I do this type of work is trying to make the status quo a little bit more tolerable. I'm totally open to much more radical proposals. When I was in graduate school, I published a paper on the feasibility of returning to a gold standard, so I'm not opposed to it like many economists are. I just think as a practical matter, it's extremely unlikely that we ever will. So the best I think we're likely to hope for in my lifetime, perhaps in your lifetime things will get even better, but I think the best we can hope for in my lifetime is to make the institution work a bit better than it has historically. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they claimed that they acted as soon as they figured out that they were horribly wrong, but in reality, what you're saying is they didn't. Is that because, similar to a bit of what Romina was talking about, they might have been like embarrassed about the mistake, and so they just kind of kept trying to cover it up, or?
Okay, so I've got two answers. One is a little cynical, and one is deeply cynical. So the sort of like lightly cynical, but kind of milquetoast answer is exactly what you said, which is that bureaucrats don't like admitting that they made mistakes, right? Which is why they love the phrase "mistakes were made." The passive voice is terrible; never use it. But mistakes were made. It's like, who made the mistake, right? Anyway, so I think one thing here is that they just didn't want to admit that they made a mistake. My much more deeply cynical view is that Powell waited to raise rates until President Biden renominated him in the summer of 2022, and that he knew that if he raised rates before then and was not playing ball with the American Reinvestment, whatever big spending bill Congress passed at the beginning of the Biden presidency, he knew that if he raised rates, he wouldn't get renominated. And so he decided to keep rates too low for too long, because it's literally right after he's confirmed rates go up. And so that's actually my view. I understand, very deeply cynical, and you might think I'm insane, but that's my view.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
On the topic of Congress and just like the executive branch influencing the Fed, who do you think would be the right role for enforcing a monetary rule? Because obviously if it's Congress or the executive, they're kind of interfering with the Fed, and if it's the Fed themselves, they could just break through that rule.
So I definitely don't think it should be the president. I think constitutionally it should be the Congress. Andy Levin at Dartmouth has written a bunch of stuff on this with Christina Paragon-Skinner on, she's a lawyer, he's an economist, on like, you look at the Constitution, right? The Constitution gives Congress the authority to define and regulate the value of money. So I think the Fed belongs rightly under like as an agency of Congress to carry out its constitutional responsibility. I don't think that central bank independence means that central banks should get to do whatever they want. I mean, I find that sort of at odds with our constitutional system, right? So what I think we want is for the Fed to be free to, free of interference from doing day-to-day monetary policy, but that does not mean that it should be free to do whatever it wants. And I'll give you a couple of concrete examples here. Starting in 2020, the Federal Reserve started wading into issues that are deeply value-laden. Diversity, equity, inclusion, racial justice, climate change. These are important issues. We should absolutely debate them, but in our system, these issues and our disagreements over these issues get handled in Congress, where we can vote on the people that represent us and give our approval or disapproval to the way in which they vote. I don't get to vote for a member of the Federal Reserve Board. I don't get to vote for presidents of the reserve banks. And so I think it's inappropriate for the Fed to start wading into these issues that frankly are the purview of Congress. So I'm not surprised that both the president and the Congress have said, look, if you want to start acting like any other government agency, well, guess what? We're going to start treating you like any other government agency. The other issue is that unlike most other government agencies, the Federal Reserve does not get an appropriation from Congress. The Federal Reserve generates a flow of income off of its asset portfolio. It covers its bills, and whatever is left over, it remits to the Treasury every year. By the way, these are for those of you who are interested in corporate profits. In the national income and product accounts, very few people know this, the remittances to the Treasury are counted as corporate profits. So if you're ever working with corporate profit time series data in the United States, you should be aware that a big chunk of that is actually Federal Reserve remittances to the Treasury. Some years it's as much as 50% of total federal corporate tax profit accruals. Anyway, just a geeky, weird little piece of information that I have. But starting a few years ago when the Fed started tightening, it's raising its interest on reserve rate, which means its interest expense is rising, and it's trying to shrink its balance sheet, which means its interest income has been falling. For the last few years, the Fed has been earning losses. It's insolvent. And so what it's doing is it's booking deferred assets. It's basically, every time it loses a dollar, it says, we will make that dollar up at some point in the future. So it's a deferred asset. But what that means is that the Treasury has now lost out on a source of revenue. And so, again, I don't think it's all that weird that the Treasury or Congress might exert some oversight to say, what are you guys spending the money on? Because they don't get an appropriate, they get to set their own budget and they get to spend it however they want. By the way, the Federal Reserve Board has its own art curator. Like they have one of the best art collections in North America. Why they need that for monetary policy, I'm not quite sure, but they have it. So I think so between the Fed earning losses and the Fed wading into value-laden issues, we shouldn't be altogether surprised that there's a lot of oversight or a lot of interference, both from Congress and the president. But if we're going to, I think, make the Fed constitutional, it should be an agency of the Congress. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So we got time for one more question.
Can you elaborate on that in terms of the Fed balance sheet? Did that have any impact with regards to all this analysis that you had been doing?
Yeah, I mean, so the balance sheet exploded, right? Because they basically said, we'll buy as much debt as we need to. It was actually worse than this. Not only were they buying Treasury debt, right? They were prepared to start buying municipal government debt. I think this is also a giant nightmare because if the Fed is now being asked to bail out insolvent state governments, Congress empowered it to do during the pandemic, then all of a sudden the state governments don't have as much of an incentive to operate their state budgets responsibly because they think they can get a bailout from the Fed. But you look, yeah, the balance sheet exploded. The reason the balance sheet exploded is that you needed to pay for all this government spending. But again, there's a major change that happened in 2008 that a lot of people, even some of the monetary money and banking textbooks have not caught up with this. In 2008, the Fed started paying interest on reserves, which means the Fed can blow up its balance sheet but neutralize all of that quantitative easing by basically paying banks not to lend. But they get themselves into this pickle of earning losses. And in fact, this was one of the theoretical criticisms of paying interest on reserves before we started doing it, is that if we found yourself in a situation like we did, here we are. Now, the Fed has shrunk its balance sheet somewhat, but it's still quite large. And I don't know how you go back to a pre-2008 system with a central bank that is this large. I've seen some, like Senator Cruz, I respect Senator Cruz, but I saw him call for Congress repealing the Fed's authority to pay interest on reserves. This would be a colossal nightmare. Because until the Fed normalizes its balance sheet, if you make it illegal for the Fed to pay interest on all those reserve balances, what are banks going to start doing? They're going to lend them out like crazy. The money supply is going to explode. And you think inflation was bad a couple of years ago? Inflation is going to get much worse. So unfortunately, I'm sort of a short-term pessimist on when it comes to what we actually do with the Fed. I'm open to more radical alternatives, but in my lifetime, I think the best we can hope for is to try to make the thing a little less bad.